Hello and welcome to part 3 in the series Understanding Depression. Now in this vidcast we'll be looking more specifically at depression in children, in particular how difficulties in earlier childhood can cause depression either during childhood or to be postponed to some later time, often many years later. So to gain a better understanding of these things we need to learn something about the ways in which children develop. Now, it might be stating the obvious that children are not the same as adults. Having said that, most adults have got no idea about child development, and how a child's thinking process is largely different to that of an adult. So if we can grasp some of these ideas, this is going to help us a great deal in understanding depression in children. So the first thing we need to do then is to take a brief look at some of the ideas about how children develop. So one of the first things that we need to do is to get some ideas about what it is that sort of goes into child development. When we say child development, we're also talking about personality development as well. They're sort of one and the same essentially. But we're going to be looking specifically at things that are more related to the generation or the susceptibility to depression later on. So there's just a few things that need repeating really, largely because they're very important to remember. As I said a moment ago, children do not think the same way as adults. I stress that because it is a very important thing to remember. Now often adults believe that children have the same reasoning ability as they do. If I could put this in bold letters, I would say this is just not true. Okay? So maybe now you might begin to appreciate why we have such a problem with teenagers. Now throughout this vidcast I'm going to use the pronoun he. It just makes things easier, and so that's the reason why I'm doing that. And what do we mean by the word child? Well, we're used to thinking of children in different ways. We think of them as infants, or you can use toddlers, children, teenagers. I don't really want to make too much of a distinction in that area unless it's necessary to make a particular point. As far as I'm concerned, a child is a child up to around about the age of 18 years old, and I know that 18-year-olds would disagree with that, but I really don't care. That idea might not be popular, like I said, but hopefully as you read or listen you might see my reasoning. Well, either way, like I said, no apologies. There are many psychologist researchers. They've studied the development of personality, of course. So I'm not going to burden you with a whole lot of sort of information, but there is some information that it's necessary to know. So in order, that we can go through and understand the various stages or ways in which a child develops psychologically, and actually how their capacity to understand anything, it's just, well, I guess I've got to say it straight away at the beginning here, it's dependent on their age. It's simply that. But there's more to it, obviously. So to that end, I'm going to talk about two researchers that are very, very famous for their work. The first one is a man called Jean Piaget, I guess he's French, and Lev Vygotsky, I think he was Russian. And these two gentlemen were very big in the area of development of thinking processes. Now, just so that we're clear, thinking processes is known in psychology as cognitive processes. So I may use the word cognitive, so I just want you to be aware that that's what I'm talking about. So if we begin by looking at Jean Piaget then and his work, well, I mean, his starting point was looking at Sigmund Freud. He was the beginning, like for every scientist studying human behavior, but in terms of cognitive development, Piaget, he conducted perhaps the most important early work. He saw the child as, like, a quote from him is, a scientist constructing its own understanding of the world. So kind of giving a child a little bit more kudos than they actually deserve as a scientist, but essentially they are what's known as an organism adapting to its environment. That was his thinking. So his theories, it provided like the first fairly robust concept of child development. So Here's what he, basically to begin with, here's what he said. He said that all children pass through certain stages of cognitive development, and that's providing that the child has not got some form of brain damage. And they follow this cognitive development in a sequence, one after the other. And he saw these as being cross-cultural, so that's universal, so it doesn't matter what human it is, they essentially go through the same stuff. Now his theory was based on a concept of what he termed schema or schemata, if you want plural. And schema, well, they are like a basic thinking structure or cognitive structure, or like a unit of intelligent behavior. So the formation of these schema, according to Piaget, in the early stages of child development, they provide the basis for the development of more complex structures as the child grows. So this could be seen as a means by which, like, a child categorizes or organizes experience, and it provides a way of understanding future experiences. So essentially, the child has to learn something very, very basic, and with a basic level of understanding, extremely basic, and then they will gradually build using that schema that they've created as the basis for future learning, and they will grow and grow and grow in terms of their complexity. But that takes years, as we will see. So he had a way of explaining these things. I mean, I'm going to very literally just brush over this. He called them the different processes in this order. First of all, assimilation. So that's fitting experiences into the schema, into these constructs, if you like. Then there's equilibrium, which is his next stage. This is a process of trying to gain a mental balance with the information that they've just got. Then disequilibrium, yes, it occurs when there's new information which does not fit the existing schema. So they've got something, it's outside of their ability to deal with, and so they are, well, obviously flummoxed in a sense. Then lastly, there's accommodation. An accommodation, that's about changing the schema to fit the new information. So previously, the disequilibrium, that's about rejecting information, and then the next one is about obviously fitting it into accommodating that information. So this is the basic concept, but you might need to think that if accommodation, if it can't be completed, then, well, this is when the creation of a new schema begins. So they'll obviously then go out of their way to change their thinking or adapt their thinking so that they actually can accommodate this new information. Now, Piaget, those are the basic ideas of the formation. Now, what he then went on to do is to develop through his research, he developed stages of ages of children and what kind of things that they would do at certain ages. So here's how it goes, and I'll try and get through this fairly quickly. So the first one, from birth to 2 years old, and he called that sensory motor stage. Now the child at this point, they learn about the world simply through the senses. They learn that objects actually, well, they don't just in fact disappear once they're out of sight. So it's like a very tiny baby will not recognize these things, but gradually they will start to recognize that, oh, something was presented to me in front of me and it's gone. And it's that level of ability to recognize and to think. So going then from 2 years old upwards to 7 years old, now in this stage the child develops gradually. It develops visual cues, symbols and language. As we all know, children start to learn to speak at around sort of 18 months to 2 years old. So the focus now is on how they look and the beginning of logical thinking. Well, of course, naturally, the child sort of develops reasoning abilities as he grows, to the point where low-level reasoning is possible, but making distinction between concepts of different ideas, like, for example, tall as opposed to tallest, they can't do that. They would just say tall. Yeah. So it's fairly simplistic, and don't forget that's up to 7 years old. So at this point, and it's something that this is quite an important point, Piaget spoke about a term that he called egocentric. Well, essentially, this is the child at this stage. It means that they tend to see the world as if they were the center of all things that happen, and that's the way that they view things. They've got no recognition that other people see things differently from them. Yeah, so that's why they believe them to be central and important, because it's a large component of the internal struggle that the child endures through adolescence, if you remember. We talked about that. Okay, so the next stage, 7 to 11 years old. At this stage, he called that concrete operational, if you want the phrase. The child gradually finds it possible to recognize the actual numbers of objects, whereas previously they couldn't do that. And then they shift away from, or they should shift away, or begin to shift away from this egocentric, this I'm the center of the universe type behavior in the previous stage. So the child begins to understand relationships between similar ideas. They can make connections that were previously not possible, but, and I use the caveat, but, there are still inabilities in being able to mentally hold simple concepts, like to compare things. So it is a developing process. So we're talking 7 to 11 years old now. Obviously, you get towards the 11 years old, and they're almost there, if you like, in that sense. And the last stage that Piaget talks about is 11 years onwards. So by this stage, child has gained the ability to manipulate ideas or propositions, whether mentally or otherwise, and simply by following verbal cues, I suppose. Now, the child can follow the form of an argument without being reliant on the actual content, which is good, because that means that they're holding information in their mind and being able to work things out using much more complex thinking or reasoning processes. These schema that we were talking about, they've now got a set of schema that they can use to work things out. But just please bear that in mind. We're talking 11 years onwards. They're still reliant on relatively simple and straightforward methods of working things out, and that's at 11 years old. Now, obviously, that should and will get more complex as time moves on, as they grow in experience. So that shows anyway that they're able to modify their schema based on what they experience. So that's Piaget. Well, the work of Piaget, it was very important, and it's been used by researchers and child workers, if you like, well, certainly for the most part of the 20th century and beyond. But by itself, there's something missing. Okay, this process of development, it's only about the processing of what's happening, within the child itself. It doesn't really take into consideration too much about what's going on around. So that's where our next researcher comes in, Lev Vygotsky. He started his work 1920s to 1930s. He looked at cognitive development as a social process. So it's a different approach to Piaget. He viewed the development of higher cognitive functioning, the planning, the reasoning, understanding, and so on, that they arrive from the social interactions that a child had with others. Now, the majority of his work centered around how cultural and interpersonal interactions shape the development process. So let's just have a quick look at cultural. Now, cultural, you have to think of that word, well, you don't have to, you can, but think of the word of cultural in terms of the country that you live in, the particular group of people within a country, for example, who have a particular way of living and doing things, thinking about things, and that can be said for groups of people, large or small, around the world. So the learning then that a child has, it's based on that surrounding cultural environment. Okay, so if you live in a small village with a very few people, you're going to, if you don't have any communication with the outside world, for example, like the Amazonian rainforest, there have been and there are still very small groups of native people who live there, and their lives are dependent entirely on what goes on in the village, and they have very little, if any, contact with the outside world, and so they remain from generation to generation mostly thinking the same way. So rather than sort of reinventing a new world with each child, the child, they can't avoid assimilating cultural information into their reasoning. So if they're in it, they can't do anything about it. It's there, and they have to take it in. They must take it in. That's part of their learning process. So I suppose a large part of that is about language. That's a primary tool that they have, and that's how in societies generally, before the advent of the internet, I guess, their accumulated cultural knowledge, it's passed on. Now, there's another way, of course, which is about interpersonal. So Vygotsky saw that the child learning was from interaction, as also between those people in the child's social circle. So unlike Piaget, he viewed the child as being a little bit more like an apprentice, okay, where they're taking part in activities with others, and they get the training. It's a training ground for them, for their learning to take place. Now, in Vygotsky, he envisaged this developmental process as one which is not, as Piaget said, which sort of had its final phase, if you like, from 11 onwards. Vygotsky is saying it's lifelong, and was largely dependent on the input through the various social connections that the child engaged in. So, if we look at worldwide societies, well, we can see how Vygotsky has a point. So the next, we could look at this in terms of a slightly different angle of social development then. We go back to our infant. As he develops, it's quite clear that interaction with others is key to learning. This is the whole point of social development. So you now imagine how a child would develop without interaction of other people, if that was at all possible. We can actually see examples of what happens in quite rare occasions nowadays, when we have come across human children that have been reared in the wild by animals. Now, I know immediately everybody's going to think of the Jungle Book, but it's not a fantasy. Maybe the story was a fantasy, but these things do happen from time to time. We do come across children like this. And they tell of children that have never known anything in their life but life in a jungle. They can't, they couldn't adapt or have any, ability to adapt to life with humans because they didn't have any contact with them. And by and large, when they've been rescued, what's found is that their learning, it was severely retarded, and their language skills almost non-existent. That's not to say they didn't learn, it's just that they didn't have the same ability to learn after they've been, captured, if that's the right word. So, while we have, all of us, we have the brain capacity to become highly intelligent people, Vygotsky says, his idea is that all this indicates that our development is limited by the environment that we find ourselves in. Now, that's not to say that it's a fixed factor. If you shift environments at a later time, what happens then? Do you like our wild child idea? They can learn. Yes, of course they can, but there is a limitation, which is placed, if you like, psychologically. And I've seen this for myself in my own work. So, generally then, Vygotsky believed personality development, it didn't just stop at a certain age, but because of the continued social interactions, a child's personality, it would continue to develop and even become modified over a lifetime. Okay, so that's kind of bringing us to the end, if you like, of looking, almost at the end of looking at child development. Let's just have a quick sort of overview, if you like, of what we've been talking about. So, having looked at the research and the observations of these two famous researchers into personality development, it's easy to appreciate that a child goes through a number of stages. So he'll begin, his ability to function in the world at birth is totally dependent on others, which is a state of affairs that sort of continues but gradually recedes as the years progress towards childhood. He does have a huge learning curve in order to make sense of the world, that's for sure. He needs to begin to find ways to interpret what his senses provide him. So we're back to the social world again and what he experiences. But he needs also to gain control of his body, something that's really hampered by a body that's continually changing and it's developing, and that's independent mostly of any mental processing. Then he has to engage in like a trial and error methods. We talked about formation and changing of schemata, things like that. And he has to develop literally millions of thinking processes, and often that could be shortcut a little bit by copying other people, you know, copying their behavior or even taking on board their method of thinking, like that sort of thing. So the complexity of these cognitive or thinking processes, it develops and continues right on and into adulthood, as I said earlier. Now, there's one or two other major ideas or areas that the child needs to begin to grasp and develop. So they need to grow a general knowledge base of information about just about everything. They need to be able to rationalize, and that's essentially a gradual learning of ever more complex thinking and strategies. They need also something we haven't mentioned so far, which is emotional intelligence. Big subject all on its own, this. So I'm just going to say this is about being able to accurately respond to the emotions that a child feels and respond to them in ways which they're appropriate for him and appropriate for those around him also. So we could use the word congruence, if you like, in that they are who they feel inside. You know, they behave in a way that's congruent with the way that they are inside, as opposed to some kind of dissonance between the two. Then, of course, children, they're building concepts, they're building belief structures, and we can call these constructs. That's what some of the psychologists call them. Then there's this socialization and how they interact with other people, and taking on board the behavioral norms. So as the child develops, they grow and develop in so many different ways, and the personality of a child, it becomes filled out with so many complexes and nuances, all of which, this makes him unique. And that's what makes us all unique, is that mix of processes that we have created for ourselves. And the more we create, the better, I suppose. But it is important to note, and I do want to stress, that for our discussion about depression, which is where we're headed in effect, it is vital that we understand certain parts, certain things about this. And the first thing to think about is a child's ability to make sense of his experience. It's limited, and I want to stress this, it is limited to the developmental level he has reached at a particular given age. So that means that a 5-year-old cannot make any rational sense out of adult behavior. It's just not possible for them. So his ability to understand at the age of 5, for example, it will be guided by highly simplistic thinking. And he will make huge assumptions based on the information, assumptions that we as adults should be able to rationalize ourselves out of making, but children don't. They haven't got the ability. So, just to give you a simple example, little Johnny, I'll give him a name, he takes a glass of lemonade and he pours it all over the cat's head. And he enjoys that reaction of the cat, and he has a really good giggle. However, Mum saw what he did, and she gets annoyed with him. Little Johnny listens to his irate mum. She's angry, and she tells him he's a bad boy and sends him to his room. Well, what's Johnny's reasoning? Well, he says to himself, in his mind, I guess, I was having fun. Mummy doesn't like to see me having fun. Next time, I will have fun where she can't see. So with that kind of thinking, it's obvious that he doesn't understand his mother's perspective of right and wrong. He hasn't learned that. And that's a concept he's just not capable of learning at that time. So he's still totally self-oriented. He hasn't learned to see anything beyond his own internal wants and desires because he thought it was fun and mum stopped it, and he just didn't understand. So in the next few years, if nothing happens to interrupt his normal development, he will gradually develop a new ability to include the concerns of others into his processing and his behaviour. And that is where we go next, essentially, is what are in fact the foundations of depression. So, as I said a moment ago, if we want to begin to understand depression in children, then first of all we've got to understand how they think, and that's what we were looking at a few moments ago. But the next thing we need to realise is that, as I said before, we can never expect a child to think as we do as adults. And I know I'm repeating myself, so forgive me, but I did say repeating things means it's important. Now, let me ask you a question. Okay, listen in. So, if a child is subjected to any form of abuse or trauma, how is it possible for any child to engage in performing a highly complex process of coping with the enormous emotions, as well as trying to find rational understanding of what's happening, when they've not yet developed the basic mental capacities for dealing with everyday life? Apologies, that was a long question, I realise. So if you obviously rewind and go back and listen to it again if you need to. But the answer, or my answer, is the only way that they are able to deal with it, which is to use, well, the tools that they currently have at their disposal, which is age dependent. They can deal with it in a limited, underdeveloped way with the mental processing that they have. And they will use childlike thinking, cognitive processes, whatever you want to call that. And they will use often a simplistic, you could even say black and white way of thinking, with very little, if any, ability to rationalize effectively. Again, age dependent. So, let me use another illustration which hopefully will show one way in which depression can become part of a child's life. This is let me talk about an imaginary child again. Okay, this time he's a happy, well-adjusted child, but then his parents, they separate and eventually divorce when he's 8 years old. The boy, well, he was devoted to his dad, but now his dad has left and he feels devastated. So that's the basic scenario. Now, here's an idea of what might be going on inside that boy's mind. So I'm just going to be that little boy for a moment and just give you some thoughts. So I'll be him. So, Dad left me and Mum. I don't understand. Why was he so upset? Why did Mum shout at him so much? I don't get it. She told me that she and my dad had fallen out and he did something that she didn't like, but she didn't say what. But that's stupid. I do things she doesn't like, and I don't have to leave forever. Anyway, what could he do that was so bad? I just don't know. I miss him. I want him to come back. He could just say sorry, couldn't he? Mum is so mad with him. She looks unhappy and she cries when she thinks I can't see. I feel all alone. Maybe it's my fault. He hasn't been home for weeks now. I didn't see him. Did I do something wrong? I asked Mum, but she says it's not my fault. I thought he loved me. So this is back to me being me again. And you can see the twists and turns of this little boy's mind. And these are unique to the child, individually, that particular child. But it's very clear that he's very unhappy and very confused. Now, every child comes up with his own way of explaining traumatic events. And usually they bear little relation to the actual truth. The directions his thinking might go could lead to all manner of faulty beliefs, which generate very strong emotions, which is something else that he is incapable of managing. We talked about emotional intelligence earlier. So as we can see from my little sort of monologue there, this particular child has come to some conclusions that are not true, but they're only based on what he feels, what he's seen, and how he's able to understand them. He can't answer his own questions as well, you know, and at least well, he doesn't get any answers that make any sense to him. So he attempts to make some kind of resolution, you know, in himself to try and reduce the emotional turmoil that he feels. So he begins to come up with his own answers based on supposition, assumption, and very little evidence. And he's filling in the blanks. And eventually, if he's not called Johnny, but we'll call him Johnny again. If he's unchallenged in these ideas, they become fixed, they become facts in his mind. And they will stay with him, probably until childhood, because unless they're dealt with, unless they are addressed, talked about, and corrected. And so what you end up with here are what you would call erroneous facts. That they lay dormant, they're unspoken, but they're based on such strong emotions that they form like a basis on which a child can, hypothetically, build the rest of his life. So, if you like, they become like cornerstones of a building, the building being his personality. And there is the foundation for depression for the future. So, let's just try and summarize, if you like, some of the facets of how depression might develop in children and its effects. So, we've already said children, they do not process the same as adults. They don't ask questions to clarify. They assume. Children, they formulate theories based on little or no evidence, except what they see and feel, and their ability to manage that thinking with the limited thinking processes that they have at that time. Children, they transpose their irrational and confused thinking into facts that they can manage based on their current level of ability, as I just said. So the child will internalize their created facts, but they can be unsubstantiated. They can be negative and destructive influences on the future development and any interaction with other people. So, as I said earlier, there's a multitude of different ways a child will process and devise his own answers. And what we need to look at now are the ways in which a child can experience this kind of confusion. It bears repeating that psychologists, they all agree, a child, you know, the younger the child, the more basic his abilities. A 5-year-old cannot do or process what an 8-year-old can. Now, given all these facts, just look at the list I'm going to read out now, and then ask yourself, how is it possible for a child of any age to effectively process any of the following scenarios? So imagine bullying, being face-to-face bullying. And nowadays you've got this cyberbullying thing as well. And the possibilities for that are endless. Domestic violence. Now, maybe when I use the phrase domestic violence, that doesn't really bring any, it might bring something to mind, but let's be more specific. Parents beating each other up, and I'm not going to say man beating woman or woman beating man, because it happens in both directions. Children witness that, they see that, they hear the shouting and the screaming and the things being thrown around the home and all of that sort of thing. The children themselves being beaten up as part of domestic violence. How do they cope with that? And then, of course, in our little example, we talked about family breakup or like disharmony. But have you thought about alcoholism or drug addiction? If one of your parents is an alcoholic, and maybe you only have one parent and he or she is an alcoholic, you're an only child, or maybe one of 2 or 3 kids, and how do you cope with a lifetime with an alcoholic parent? Again, I've worked with people who've been through this, and the problems are there. How about poverty, for example? It sounds easy, but living a life where you're living hand to mouth has an effect. How about peer pressure? You see, this is something that children have to cope with on literally a daily basis every time they go to school. The effect on them of what other people expect and how you should fit in with the team, with the group. How do they cope with that? Especially if they've got their own ideas and wishes. How about death in the family? Death of a close relative, a grandparent, or even a parent, or a brother or a sister. Imagine how much turmoil that causes in a child's mind, and the ways that they deal with that. And of course we talked about abuse of different sorts, so you've got the emotional, sexual, psychological abuse. And then, depending on the age of the child, of course, there's this thing that adults use, this word that they use called stress. Do children experience stress? Of course they do. You think about your children when they have to take exams. That's just one example. An exam at school is incredibly stressful. And then there's just a variety of social pressures. So you've got a whole range of things that have an effect, or potentially have an effect. And if you go back to our thinking about the child's ability to process information at specific ages, what you're going to see is, as an adult, you can go through my little list here and you can say, yeah, well, I can see how I would process all of that, how I would deal with all of that. But that's you at pick an age, 35, for example. 35, you're better equipped, if you like, to deal with those things. I'm not saying that you are going to be able to manage it effectively, but we are at least grown-ups, essentially, with a fully functioning personality and ability to rationalise and so on. Children, no, they can't. So I just want you to be aware that any one of the things that I've just been through, I've talked about, they can be contributory factors to depression at a later time, or in fact at the time it's actually happening. And, well, like I've just said, that there are so many issues that a child can encounter. I mean, it would literally take a whole series of vidcasts just to cover all of these. But I can say that as I look at my list now, I can say I have been through 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 of those in the list I've been through myself, and I've managed to come through it all, but with some difficulty. So let's just talk a little bit more then about the pressures that come from society. All right? The children of today are in a situation that earlier generations didn't face before. They're deluged with a barrage of TV and internet ideas, that they're filled with themes and concepts that they are very ill equipped to cope with developmentally. And this is a very big problem, and it's largely ignored. It's pushed under the carpet by a lot of people, especially those people who run TV stations and things like that, because they don't want to appreciate software companies and all of these, that watching Game of Thrones is great. It's okay for adults, surely. If you've seen Game of Thrones as an example, it's very entertaining, but you put a 5-year-old in front of Game of Thrones, and is that appropriate? Is that something that they can deal with? Is that not going to have some effect on their thinking? Especially if you force them to sit and watch all 8 seasons of it, as I have. It is being ignored. It's not. People don't see it as a problem, but it is. It has an effect. So there's also a great big push in our society to conform. To conform to ideas that people, well, only a generation behind them, they see them as bizarre and outlandish. But society today has this very strong conformist attitude. And we bring up our children. Now, I brought up my children, and for sure they rebelled against my my upbringing, if you like, my attitudes and behaviour, and that surprised me greatly. But you know, our children, they're being subjected to more than they really have the mental capacity to be able to assimilate correctly. Now, if you think only a few hundred years ago in Britain, perhaps not even that long ago, children were often used as workers. You know, this was just before compulsory education was around. So if you think, we still had child chimney sweeps in the late 19th century, or maybe later. You know, this is an issue because it's one which operates in a creeping, insidious way. You know, we all bear a responsibility, or we should have a responsibility, to try and keep children, especially under 12s, they're isolated from the world of adulthood. And when I say isolated, I don't mean completely isolated, but protected from. Yeah. And it's not just my idea. You know, if you look at the film censor boards for movies, for example, you will see that, well, you know, other people have got a similar idea. There are movies for children, there are movies for, well, you need to have parental guidance, there are movies for, well, up to 15-year-olds, and then there's adult-rated movies. There's a reason for that. It's not just there because it gave somebody a job. So pressures from society in general, and peer pressure in particular, is immense. So you've got so many conflicts that can arise from these, what appear to be simple facts, but they cause, they can cause, you know, depression in children and young people, among other things. So, as I said, as you can see, there's such a vast range of things. It's impossible for me to go through all of those things, or even some of them, but to highlight the things that are causing problems for our children. So, I guess the only thing that's left to us really is to be able to identify, is to be able to see. We can do our best to try and protect children from these things, but we're not ever going to be able to cut children off completely from the world in which we live. So the best thing we can do really is to try and identify any issues that might come up for children if they may be in fact depressed. To be honest, it's easier to detect children, I think, in children than it is in adults. That's not to say it's easy, because it isn't. I mean, children are not usually as well practiced at hiding their feelings compared to adults, so the adults have a lifetime of practice at doing that. What makes it harder for parents and others to spot the symptoms is when a child isolates themselves for extended periods, like children sitting in front of their games consoles or computers, or tucked away in their rooms doing something. I don't know. Do they still read books nowadays? I don't know. So it's only by interacting directly with children can you actually gauge their mood. So, you know, the solution then is quite obvious, yet it's a challenge. And the answer is, we need to spend more time with our children, talking to them. That sounds simple, doesn't it? Well, we can get some difficulties there. Imagine then you've got what's the response when you ask the question, are you okay? Are you okay? Because you know what the answer is likely to be. Fine, I'm fine. Which, if you know, there's a code for that. That's a code for leave me alone. Actually, the problem with that question, well, asking questions that require like a yes or no answer, they're pretty pointless really, because you're not going to get any information. You're just going to get one-syllable results, responses from that. So, my suggestion is to start using questions with young people and children that are open questions, not closed ones. So, you can ask how or what. Start the questions with how or what, why, when. And then work from there. That's called Socratic questioning, if you fancy the name. So, it depends on the child's age, really, in question. And you're likely to come up against other problems, specific to children, in that they'll often have limited vocabulary. So it's very difficult for them to explain how they're feeling, even if they want to explain it. And also, as regards the reason for depression, you can expect the same "I don't know" answer as we get from adults, because they won't know. I mean, if they did know, then the problem's likely not depression at all, but just something that's upset them. So bear that in mind. Check it out. Now, above all with children, don't jump to conclusions. I know the communication with them isn't easy, so it's up to you as the adult to be wise. Use common sense. Don't make the same mistake that children do and make assumptions. Get facts. Listen. Ask. Ask more. And only when you're absolutely sure, well, that's when you need maybe to recommend some kind of treatment. So that brings us pretty much to the end of this vidcast. So we are at the end of our series on depression. Of course, there's much more that we could learn, much more that we can be saying about this condition. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of condense this subject into, these are relatively short messages, really. I just hope that you managed to gain something from them. Now, being on YouTube, you can revisit them and you can go back over points that you want to clarify. And I've put timestamps or time tags in the descriptions for each of the major sections to try and help you if you want to replay any of this. So that's pretty much all for now. I hope you'll take a look at my website, which is www.stephencrisco.com. It's my mental health blog. And I'll be back in the near future with some more help with regards to other mental health awareness. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you return and learn some more. Bye for now.